Hi everyone, welcome to episode 87 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So I'm joined today by Brenton Potter. Thanks for joining me, Brenton.
Hi Jarrod, thanks for having me.
We thought we'd go through a few of the questions that we get asked at initial meetings that we have on a very regular basis with prospective clients. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different scenarios that our clients are in, whether or not they're buying investment properties, homes, and then obviously there's different dynamics, different requirements that they've all got. So we thought it would give you some good insights as to some of the questions that other people have and the way we tend to address them and some of the answers that we have for them. So let's get straight into it.
Sure.
The first one is, how long should I expect for it to take for you guys to find me a property?
Yeah, I mean, it's a common question we get asked a lot. Look, for us, we don't put a time limit on finding the right property. If it's an investment property, it's more around, for us, focusing on the architectural style, the right street, the right location, the surrounding amenities. So that could take, depending on market conditions, anywhere from 2 to 3 months or longer sometimes. So if we do find the right property before then that's fine. But at the moment, in the last 12 months, we've been finding that it takes anywhere between 2 and 3 months. As a homeowner, where your requirements might be slightly different in terms of number of rooms, or I want to be in a certain school zone, then that can actually, the search can be a little bit longer than that too.
Well, you're exactly right. So investment versus home is probably the biggest thing. And with some home buyers, they've got a really a variety of options that they would consider. Yep. Others have got a very, very specific niche mark.
That's exactly right.
I've spoken about this on the podcast, but with you before as well. I had a client a number of years ago that had a very particular brief in East Melbourne. And it was a very particular, East Melbourne's a small enough suburb as it is, but this was a very small sector of East Melbourne that they wanted to be in. And it took 2.5 years to find the right property. Yeah. Now, that's not common, but when you've got something specific that you need, it can take that. But when it's an investment and I just want the best property for X, it's more about what's available at the time and making sure, as you said, it hits the right brief.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Speaking of, I guess, properties and another question that we do get asked a lot, more so, or particularly for houses.
Yep.
Bricks versus weatherboard, and what's a better option, whether it's investment or what should I buy?
And some clients we tend to find too have preconceived ideas, so they come in and say, "Well, I'm only going to buy a brick house."
That's right.
And it's very rarely that they'll come in and say, "I only want a weatherboard."
Yeah.
Most people are open to it, but some do come in and say, "I only want brick." And look, sometimes it's from a cultural perspective. Some cultures, that's all you would ever build. I know from my university days over in Adelaide that there's a mindset over there that because everything over there is brick or sandstone or render, but it's not. They don't have weatherboard. And I had friends come and stay with me at a little weatherboard cottage I'd bought in Ballarat, and they couldn't understand why I bought that property.
Yeah.
But that's more of a mindset thing. So sometimes it can be from a cultural perspective. But then it's understanding what you're wanting to buy. And if everything was equal, so if you line two properties up next door to one another in a suburb that both considers brick and weatherboard as being good options, and they were the same size, the same floor plan, the same condition, the brick is probably going to achieve more of a premium.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But in certain suburbs, weatherboard is not only accepted, but it's almost the expectation. And this is Melbourne focused, obviously. But there's others where you might go to, say, Carlton Fitzroy, where a weatherboard is shunned and it's not what's expected and people don't want it. So it's not a case of, I don't think you should buy brick or you should buy weatherboard. It's, again, dependent upon a number of other factors that would come into play.
Regardless, I think the important thing to remember there for homes is that there's always going to be maintenance, whether it's weatherboard or brick as well.
Correct. So. And that's probably another big thing with it, is that people love brick homes, but when you get into the period double brick homes, they are great from a acoustics perspective. They can hold heat fairly well, but they can also be freezing cold, and they are expensive to renovate because it's a lot, the work, the walls, the foundations, everything's a lot heavier. Whereas a weatherboard home is a more relatively easier and can be more affordable to do it too.
Mm-hmm.
Next question that we've got here is when we're buying an apartment, do we have a preference in terms of a level that we want to buy on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that we weigh up when selecting or when considering levels on apartments. You can look at ground floor, which can have courtyards attached, which can be quite valuable. But in certain suburbs, that can be a risk,
Yeah.
security wise for certain people. If you're considering, first floor or top floor at the front of a block, you could have a really nice aspect. Um, but then weighing that up also is the amount of stairs that you could be climbing and taking, and then
Particularly the older style blocks.
Yeah, the older style blocks, and what market, that appeals to or not as well.
Yeah,
So,
well, that's right. And so then there's so many positives and negatives around ground floor versus middle floor versus top floor. So again, and we sound like we're sitting on the fence, but it's not a one size fits all strategy.
no.
So it's a case by case basis. You could have a top floor apartment that's got stunning city views, or you could have a top floor apartment that faces out to the bay. And I've seen this plenty of times, and then people don't like them because as soon as you go out onto the balcony, you can't sit out there because it's too cold and blowy and windy for most of the year. So it's not a one size fits all strategy, and I think that's for people to remember.
And we've had, requirements from owner occupier clients as well. Their budget only gets them so far in a certain suburb, but one of the requirements is to have an outdoor area, a space, or a courtyard for their dog, and that's where that can be more important and evaluated from that front too.
Yeah. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Another question that we both get asked a lot is, how do you handle negotiations?
Yeah, and this is, I guess, again, a scenario perspective, and how we handle negotiations. I guess the first question that we would typically ask is, how does the agent plan to handle the negotiation?
Yeah.
Because a big thing is you can't go in expecting to be able to stamp the fist on the desk and say, this is what we want. It's a case of, well, how are you going to handle it? If you've got multiple parties, what do you do? And once you've got basically the rules of engagement as to what the agent's going to do, then we can lay out a plan as to how we're going to put offers forward, how we're going to negotiate, and what we'll do to try and get the best result possible. That's from a purely private sale perspective. When it comes to a negotiation, perhaps at a pass-in with an auction, it obviously differs depending upon the scenario of how it's passed in. So how we would approach a negotiation if we're the only person that's put in an offer, put in a bid, and it's passed in to us with no one else there, well, that's going to be very different compared to if we had to bid against three people and it's just fallen short of what we might think the reserve is. So understanding the rules and where everything sits is probably the most important thing to start with.
Yeah, it's very handy to know, because a lot of prospective clients that come in and speak to us, they're not even aware that there are different rules for different agencies. So it's a really good point you made.
So is it going to be a high? So to give people an example, in that scenario of what sort of rules of engagement. So it could be that it's a highest and best scenario. So you'll get a deadline and you've got to put your best foot forward, and that's it. There'll be others where it might be, we're going to be transparent. We're going to disclose all offers, and we're going to just basically go backwards and forwards until we get to a highest price.
Yeah.
Others will do that, but without disclosing, and they'll just say, oh, you've been beaten, but they won't tell you how much. Others will revert to a boardroom auction or an online auction now. And you'll get the same sort of opportunities, and you'll be able to see everything that's going on in front of you. So all of that's really important to know before you declare your hand and put your offer forward.
Absolutely.
Another one that I think we get asked fairly regularly is, do we have access to off-market properties? Now, I always find this one really interesting, because for those that aren't in the property market, they feel as though there's this big secret world that only a few people have got access to.
Yeah, and I feel like there used to be. I guess the definition off market versus pre-market is a big thing as well. There's a number of properties that we get the heads up on that we might inspect and get through, and then the agent says to us, "Great, photos are next Wednesday. We're online the week after that." So, but yeah, back to your point. We still do transact off market. I wouldn't say, it's our most popular way. There's a number of things to consider when you're buying off market. Is the property right? That's first and foremost. Is from an investment perspective or from a lifestyle element, is it the right property for you? From there, what I find is that a lot of the off markets that we get presented, not all of them, but a lot of them can have some kind of compromise to them.
Yep.
Or it can sometimes be a vendor testing out the market and it's overpriced in terms of what their expectations are or what they'd like to achieve off market too. So,
And it's a tactic that we see when we're working from a vendor advisory perspective that agents use to secure a listing
yes,
too. So in that they'll say, oh, well, let's go and test the market and see if the property's worth this. Oh, it's probably not worth that. But if we put pressure on by declaring that it's going to go online, then you might get competition. And all of a sudden the agent's generated a listing.
that's right.
And they've promised the world and said, oh, well, we think you can get this, wherein the vendor's actually not all that motivated. And that's a key thing with a lot of off markets I've found over the years, is that you want to find out how motivated the vendor is to actually sell the property, because in a lot of circumstances they're not.
Yeah.
I saw one come through on our emails, it was only 2 days ago, and it was a single fronted property in a okay street, I would say, in Paran, and they were chasing over $4 million for this property. Yeah. And so when I looked at that and thought, I just can't understand how that's even, you could put that forward, let alone have an expectation of that. And I would expect that that's probably vendor driven.
Yeah.
And they're not prepared to commit thousands of dollars to advertising on a price that's so far out of reality, it's not funny.
Yeah. So I mean, we do buy off markets. Approach it with caution, like anything in terms of the properties that we consider anyway.
Yeah.
So
what
happens if you have two clients on any one property, or if you have two clients on one property?
We don't ever have two on one property, and it is a common question. What do you do? But we don't ever have two clients on one property. We might from time to time have a client call and say, I've got interest in this property, can you help me? And if we've already committed to someone else, then the first comment would be, sorry, we can't assist you.
Yeah.
And whether or not that means that we can point them in the direction of someone else that can, we might be able to do that, but it certainly wouldn't be someone from within our office. We've had from time to time where we've been assisting a vendor from a vendor advisory perspective, and a client's come and said, well, what about this one? And we've had to say, look, we're already committed on the vendor side of things. We can't assist you on that. So it's very much about making sure that there's no remote consideration that we might be working either side or working for two people, because you can't do that.
That's important. You're right. Yeah.
Last one that I've got here is, should I buy a fully renovated property? And I think we'll look at this. This is more from an investor's perspective rather than from an owner-occupier. As an investor, should I buy a renovated property, or should I buy something that's unrenovated and then add value to the property?
Yeah, so from an investor's perspective, I think we want to get that balance right of the underlying land value versus improvements. And if you end up paying too much for the improvements, I think that can have an impact on the long-term growth overall of your investment property. So you want to get that balance right. You don't want to be buying something that's going to be a money pit also in that instance. So you're going to have to be spending tens of thousands of dollars straight away. But yeah, from an investment perspective, I would say that it's that property that has maybe had the renovation 10 or 15 years ago, and there's still a lot of life left in it. That in the next 10 or 15 years, you can add your own value down the track to potentially. Or it's over to the next buyer if you decide to dispose of it.
Yeah, and it really depends on the amount of renovation, as you said. I mean, a property that might have been renovated even 20 to 30 years ago, that's had everything done from a structural perspective, so everything's in the right position, but cosmetically it doesn't present overly well.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good way for people to add value, not just from a capital perspective, but from a rental point of view as well. And I think particularly in the current market, and I think that's also something to consider, but in the current market whereby there's not a lot of appetite for people to do work, people are still very cautious around having to deal with trades, the cost of work of doing these sorts of things. But if you've got people that you trust and can help you with that side of things, I think it's a good way to be able to add value in a short space of time, and also to add some really strong rental returns as well, because there is still really strong competition from a rental perspective. And I think if you know the sort of work that can add value, you can increase the value of your property beyond what it will cost if you know what you're doing. The only alternative is where the best thing that people can do is if they've got a skill set themselves, or if they've got a family friend, or they're within the industry where they can add value. So if you're a tradie, or your brother is, or your sister is, or whoever, and they can come out and do significant structural works, probably more so, as you said, from a home buyer point of view, then I would take that on. And because you've got an ability to add value that others perhaps don't have that ability to. So it's a case by case, but if you've got the skill set or you've got the opportunities to be able to do that, I think it's a good thing to be able to do.
Yep.
Very good. All right, that's about it for today's podcast. Thanks for joining me, BP. It was good to have you in.
Thanks, Jarrod.
That's episode 87 in the book. If you would like to share the podcast far and wide with friends, family and colleagues, we'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, if you'd like further property information, please visit our website, wakelin.com.au. And otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.